This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to day one of the Politico Healthcare Summit. I'm Joanna Roberts, Politico's health editor, and I'm delighted to see everybody here today. This is Politico's 8th Healthcare Summit, it's my first, and it's coming at quite a frustrating time, I think, in health policy. With the pandemic over, the policy eyeballs have really shifted away from health. Just think of President von der Leyen's State of the Union address last month, where health policy got little more than a passing mention. But while many people outside of the room may have turned their attention away from health, I think that everybody in this room is only too aware that some of the biggest challenges in health policy don't lie behind us, but instead are in front of us. Healthcare workforces across Europe are nearing crisis point, at the very time when an aging population is increasing demand. With climate change, Europe is facing new diseases, while war and migration are presenting new challenges for health systems across the world. The threat of new pandemics is with us, yet vaccine hesitancy has never been higher, and question marks hang over if and how we can organise at international level to face these threats. The good news is there are exciting new technologies in healthcare, but to deploy them we'll need forward-looking policy rules. And then add into all of this the legislative mad dash before the European election in June to complete the files on substances of human origin, the European health data space, and of course the pharma legislation on which work is just getting started. So that's going to be the topic on which we kick off the summit, and we'll be debating two critical elements: whether it'll destroy Europe's pharma competitiveness, and what's really the best way to ensure fair access to medicines. So we'll be discussing all of these challenges and more over the next 2 days. I will be your MC for the event, but most of the time you'll be in the very capable hands of our health reporters, a couple of whom are at the back, Helen Collis, Carlo Marticelli, and Ashley Furlong. So before we dive in, I'd like to thank our partners who've made the summit possible. Our leading partners, AstraZeneca, FPA, Emergent, Pfizer, and PPTA, as well as our presenting partners, Intuitive, Janssen, Novavax, and STADA, and our visibility partner, the European Federation of Nurses. A few important housekeeping rules. We're using the Swap Card platform for questions, so just scan your QR code on any of the screens around the venue. There are also instructions on the event website. If you're already connected, please chat amongst yourselves, or please do ask questions. There's a question box to the right on the desktop screen and below the live stream if you're viewing on your mobile. Now, we do like debate, so please do talk about us on X or on Twitter, whichever you want to call it, or whatever the social media platform of your choice is. Our hashtag is Politico Healthcare. And now, we'll hear opening remarks from Ruud Dobber, the Executive Vice President and President of the Biopharmaceuticals Business Unit at AstraZeneca, followed by an opening interview with Jeremy Farrar, Chief Scientist at the World Health Organization, led by Ashley. Thank you very much, and enjoy the summit.
Thank you so much, Joanna, for a very nice introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, today I think we find ourselves at a very pivotal moment for healthcare in Europe. One that will undoubtedly shape the future of healthcare on this continent for the next 2 decades. It's hard to believe, but it's now over 3 years since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, which exposed vulnerabilities in healthcare systems across Europe, the effects of which continue to be felt. This is on top of mounting challenges caused by climate change, political and economic instability, brought into sharp focus by recent weather and natural disasters, Of course, conflicts at our European borders and rising cost of living. Add to that the ticking time bomb of Europe's aging population. Estimates suggest that by 2050, more than 1 in 3 Europeans will be aged 65 or older, further contributing to the rising burden of chronic diseases. This challenge cannot be underestimated, and it affects the lives of millions, strains our economies, and even impacts our planet's health. As we take stock of European health policy and look ahead to a new European election cycle next year, we have a key opportunity to set the path for the next 20 years for Europe's healthcare landscape, one that must be more resilient, sustainable, and forward-looking. As a European citizen and the head of biopharmaceuticals at a global healthcare company, I firmly believe that the European Union and all stakeholders within the healthcare ecosystem have a vital role to play. While recent EU initiatives, including Europe's Beating Cancer Plan and the Healthy Together NCD strategy, are a commendable starting point, more focused efforts are required to tackle conditions responsible for the highest rates of preventable mortality in Europe. Beyond cancer, this includes diseases like cardiovascular diseases, respiratory diseases like COPD and chronic kidney disease, all of which are closely interconnected and share common risk factors. First and foremost, it's essential to shift our healthcare paradigm from sick care to healthcare. The burden of chronic diseases is staggering, with over 4 million lives lost annually in Europe alone. We spend approximately 70 to 80% of healthcare costs, that's equivalent to roughly $700 billion a year, on managing these diseases, while less than 3% is allocated to their prevention and early detection. We simply cannot just build more hospitals and appoint more resources to already stretched workforces and systems. We need to free up capacity by finding alternative solutions. Taking proactive steps to detect, diagnose, and treat diseases earlier will help to achieve this. Early intervention will ease the resource and financial strain on health systems, with the potential to generate billions of euros in savings throughout the EU. We also need to pave the way for new, groundbreaking disease-curing innovation. European patients deserve access to cutting-edge medical therapies, but investment in European research and development has declined by 25% over the past 2 decades. This continent conducts significantly fewer clinical trials than the United States and China, and only 1 in 5 new medicines now originates from Europe. To attract R&D investment, we must advocate for regulatory frameworks that facilitate medical research. We must advocate for faster access to advanced therapies. The current revision of the EU pharmaceutical legislation is a key opportunity to ensure we get this right. Lastly, the climate crisis poses an enormous challenge to public health, making environmental sustainability an imperative not only for the planet, but also for patients. Already, nearly 40 million people die every year from climate change and climate change-related diseases. This is only projected to increase. The healthcare sector itself is responsible for about 4.4% of greenhouse gas emissions. To put that into context, if the healthcare sector were a country, it would be the 5th largest emitter to the planet. At the same time, in many cases, earlier treatment outside of acute hospital settings can make a significant difference in decarbonizing care. This is a critical area for focus. In closing, I implore all of us to join forces in shaping the future of Europe's healthcare. We need to reverse the trends we are seeing, or the European healthcare landscape remains at risk. The time for change is now. It's in all our hands to make it happen, and we as an industry want to be part of the solution. I firmly believe that together we can force a path to find win-win solutions that benefit our populations, economies, and our beautiful planet. Thank you so much.
Good morning. I'm Ashley Furlong, a healthcare reporter at Politico, and I'm really, really delighted to be opening the summit today with an interview with the World Health Organization's chief scientist, Jeremy Farrar. We're talking in a time of immense global upheaval. There are conflicts taking place all over the world, all of which are having devastating impacts on health, not only for those populations, but for their neighbors and for the wider regions. At the same time, as we've heard this morning already, the real threat of climate change is knocking on everyone's door, including Europe's. We have wildfires, flooding, deadly mosquitoes. While all this is going on in the background in Geneva, diplomats are working to prevent the next pandemic by negotiating a new pandemic treaty. The man tasked with making sense of the science underpinning much of that and ensuring that the global decisions are backed by that science is sitting next to me. Before we start, just a few housekeeping remarks to remind you. I know Joanna already told you, but just to remember, please do engage with us and on the Swap Card platform. If you're in the room, you can scan the QR code on the screens. Otherwise, look at the instructions on the event website. And I'll be taking, hopefully, a couple of questions from that app. So, Jeremy, there's only been one other chief scientist before you. You can make the role what you want, and you have a quite wide mandate. With all these crises that we've been speaking about, what are your key priorities for the next 2 years?
Yeah, thanks very much for inviting me, and it's great to see some young friends in the audience back there and some new colleagues, I'm sure. Yeah, listening to the opening remarks and then that question, actually an opening I often give, you often feel as if you should just walk out the room and give up. Yeah, I've never known another time in my professional or personal life, which goes back quite a few decades, where the world has felt so disrupted, discombobulated, geopolitics pulling us in all sorts of directions. Who would have thought we would have war in Europe, war in Africa, war again in the Middle East? And I think on behalf of everybody, all our thoughts go to everybody involved in that terrible conflict going on at the moment. But at some point, you have to come out of that. We haven't mentioned economics and inflation and demographic shifts and climate change, but I think there are moments in history when these bad things come together at once, but you don't come out of them by chance. You come out of them because those people with agency and authority and influence and power make some decisions to say we can't keep working like that. And we are going to both try and deal with this morning's problems and plan for a future which is going to look very different. And at the moment, one of my concerns in the sort of geopolitical context is I think it's extraordinarily difficult for many, many countries to deal with today and this afternoon's problems whilst also preparing for the world that we know is coming, not some decades for your grandchildren, but climate, demographic shifts, inequality, whatever you may choose. And I think what we've got to do is try and step back from the horror of what we're thinking about and think, how do we make a change? I would argue, and obviously from my role, I'm only 4 months in, so I'm not yet institutionalized, that science has got a role to play in that. And I think science, as we've learned in the last 3 years, yes, of course, I mean biomedical science. Yes, of course, I mean the role of industry and pharma. But I mean much broader than that. Because if we don't incorporate understanding of how people work, how people go about their lives, how people connect within their communities, social and behavioral science, then I don't think we'll bring the greatest benefits to all. But I remain optimistic because ultimately you cannot live in the world we currently live in and accept that.
Mm. Many people in the audience are trying to figure out what the next, big health threat is for Europe. Whether it's disease X, there's a lot of R&D and funding going towards preparing for the next pandemic. I'm wondering, do you think that the biggest threat is this disease X, or is it something that's actually already here that we should be more focused on?
So, disease X is a phrase that actually I was very involved in establishing with many, many others within the WHO R&D blueprint, to talk about something we do not yet know about. And if you go back over the last century or so, there's certainly been some of those. HIV probably first arrived in the humanity in the 1930s or so. And of course, as a young doctor in London, I was at the very start of that HIV epidemic. But most things we know about. And I've made a very strong plea, whilst we do consider what would happen to the world if another disease X came, how well would we be prepared? I think the best way of preparing for anything is to make sure you're good every Monday and Tuesday. What you have before a pandemic hits will largely determine your ability to respond to it. In my view, that goes to everything from healthcare capacity. If you now go to the very many complicated, difficult to interpret reviews of different countries and how they responded to the pandemic, it's clear to me that some themes come through. If you had huge inequality in your country, that inequality came to the fore. If you had limited healthcare resources, those limited healthcare resources came to the fore. If you had fantastic genomics, then you probably used those genomics pretty well during the pandemic. If you had great industry, whether the BioNTechs, Modernas, the AstraZenecas, the University of Oxford link on their vaccine, then they will probably be able to pivot. So if you don't have those, or you're running your health system and your scientific ecosystem at its bare minimum, try and establish that on Tuesday morning when the pandemic hits, and you'll fail. So one of the pleas, I think, is whilst we think about the next pandemic, which could be this afternoon, it could be in 50 years' time, but it will happen for sure, let us make sure that we build the right systems that are functioning for society and communities this afternoon and tomorrow, because that's also the only way to build trust. And I remember being in the North Kivu in Democratic Republic of Congo in 2019 with the Ebola vaccine. And what did the community say? Why are you coming to us now on something you care about for Ebola when you weren't here last week, last month, last year, when my child was dying because of anemia or whatever? So if we leave systems, all systems, from industry to regulators to science to industrial complexes, and we think we can just establish them in a crisis, you won't. You won't. So my plea would be to not just build a roof when the rain falls, but to make sure we have those things in place all of the time. And that's very difficult for governments at the moment that are struggling with this afternoon's challenges to think, what do we have to put in place economically, fiscally, incentives in our universities, in our industry, in order to prepare for that pandemic. But in my view, the best preparation for pandemic X is to make sure you're good at what you're doing today.
I want to go back from before you were welcome, and you gained quite extensive experience in infectious diseases, including ones that affect tropical regions. Now, in Europe, we're seeing increasingly these diseases that didn't used to affect Europe, like dengue and tiger mosquitoes coming to Europe. Are these tropical diseases no longer so tropical, or is everywhere tropical now? Really, like, what are we going to be seeing more and more of this? And is this something that we need to be really on the lookout for?
Yeah, for sure. And I think sometimes it gets overstated. It's going to cause everything to be everywhere, but without doubt, I spent originally trained as a neurologist, which is why it's slightly odd that I went into infectious diseases. But having spent 20 years in Vietnam, when I first went to Vietnam in 1995, and for those of you who know that long, thin country, Ho Chi Minh City in the south was tropical. Hanoi in the north had 4 seasons. Hanoi in the north in the winter got down to 4 or 5 degrees, sort of similar to Brussels this morning, it felt. There were no Aedes mosquitoes carrying dengue in Hanoi in 1995. It's now endemic. You've seen the huge outbreaks of dengue in Bangladesh, in Dhaka recently. And of course, it's endemic in all of Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Central and South America, and now endemic in southern United States, and there is transmission of dengue in Italy going on at the moment. So if you wanted a poster child for a disease of the 21st century, in my view, one of them would be dengue. The mosquito is beautifully adapted to dirty cities. It only flies about 75 meters from here to the end of the room in its life, and so it needs dense population of communities to survive. And you need 4 serotypes of the virus circulating. So climate change, humidity and temperature make a big impact. So yes, dengue is going to become endemic in certainly the southern United States, and I would predict in southern Europe. The big fear for dengue and dengue as a word is a Swahili word originally, is that it becomes established in sub-Saharan Africa. You imagine, having worked at Children's Hospital No. 1 in Ho Chi Minh City for 20 years, during the rainy season in Ho Chi Minh City, that hospital is absolutely packed with children and young adults with dengue. Imagine that happening in southern hospitals of Europe, way beyond what you saw in COVID. And each child or adult needs intensive looking after. It's a very difficult treatment, disease to manage. That would overwhelm health systems. And so those are the sorts of things we need to be preparing for now, not waiting till it happens because it's inevitable, and preparing our health systems to have that sort of resilience that we heard about in the opening remark, rather than putting efficiency at the top of everything. So climate change will have these effects. Extreme heating, people with cardiovascular disease, lung disease, having much more stressful events during temperatures of 40, 42 degrees. And mostly, our cities are not designed to deal with those temperatures. And so if we think of these long-term trends, inequality, demographic shifts, climate change, we need to see governments acting now to put in place what's going to be needed in order to respond to those.
Underpinning, many of those sort of responses to climate change are quite often unpopular policies. Ultra-low emission zones, car-free zones, policies that politicians might say, well, Jeremy, yeah, I understand we need to do that, but I'm not going to be voted in next time if I implement that. How do you have those conversations with governments and with politicians?
Yeah, I think this goes back to something I said earlier, which is, I think we all understand the political drivers, which are, I'm not saying politicians are dishonourable in any way, shape or form, but their major thing is to get re-elected. And the re-election cycle is sometimes not the same as the cycle of demographic shifts and climate. And so you implement some major changes today, and it's unlikely that you as an individual politician may gain the benefits from that in the electoral cycle. It may be your successor or your one after. We have to appeal to the honourable nature of all politicians to think these are the right things to do. There's two other aspects, though, which obviously I come from a health and clinical and public health background. I don't think we've made the case that climate is actually a health issue anywhere near strong enough. We've made the case through the climate community, for whom I have the greatest respect, that this is something linked to, say, 2 degrees warming that may affect your children or your grandchildren in mid-century. Well, try and persuade a 16-year-old to not smoke because they may get lung cancer in 30 or 40 years' time. It's a tough thing to do. I think we need to bring the nexus of climate and its impact on health today through impact of environmental change, pollution. The pandemics are clearly a result of changing climate and changing environment. The heat, the number of individuals, I don't suppose even in this room of highly involved and educated people would know how many people across Europe died last summer during heat waves. It's a staggering number. We need to make sure that all of our healthcare, and healthcare is, we heard it earlier, a percentage of overall emissions. We can do something as a community to reduce those. And we should act. We shouldn't just say this is all about whether you fly in airplanes or you have a SUV car or you do this or do that. We as a community have got to own what we produce and reduce that list. And lastly, I would say we've also got to make, I think, the positive case that the transition into a zero-carbon economy is the economic opportunity of the 21st century. Whichever country or countries or regions make that transition, you are going to be ahead. It is no surprise. I mean, the geopolitical tensions between Europe, between America and China at the moment are extreme. But look what China is doing in terms of investment in new technologies for climate, for zero climate. It's enormous. I think if we have not made the case that climate is a health issue, and we've not made the case that this is actually the economic opportunity of the 21st century, akin to the building of railways and the coming of data in the 20th century. So it's seen as a net negative that you're going to have to pay a price. And I think we need to change that narrative into a slightly more optimistic one of the opportunity.
Something my colleagues and I have been observing recently is that on a global level, it seems like it's really hard to secure cooperation on some of the really important health issues. The negotiations for the pandemic treaty we've seen have been really difficult. At UNGA, we saw countries battle to agree on quite substantial language on health issues. Do you think it's getting more difficult to secure agreement on these controversial issues when we're not sort of in the midst of a pandemic and everyone's like, yeah, we need to agree on this?
Yeah, it is undoubtedly more difficult, but that only just makes it more important. The pandemic of the last 3 years, which, by the way, having had COVID 10 days ago, and I'm now non-infectious, I promise you, the pandemic is not suddenly over. And talk of COVID going away is now ridiculous. COVID is with us now in some shape or form forever, hopefully still protected by great vaccines and therapeutics. But yeah, getting agreement on substantive issues at the moment across the geopolitical divide is extremely difficult. That makes it even more important to achieve it. And I'm not pointing or looking at any particular country here. The current geopolitics looks challenging. Just think forward 2 or 3 years to what may or may not happen in various jurisdictions of the world and ask yourself whether that's going to make it better. So there is a window of opportunity at the moment when it is just possible, by the world coming together, that you could find an agreement. Not a perfect agreement, but at least an agreement on which a foundation can be built for the future. And the Pandemic Accord Treaty and the IHR regulations that you're talking about there, and having been involved in some that are very tense, and they're extremely difficult. I do pay tribute here. I'm not sure diplomats are the best people to stop a pandemic happening, as in your opening remarks, but they are good at not getting angry when things are, and it's not a job I could do. I think I'm more optimistic than some that we will have some sort of accord agreement in May of next year. And whilst it won't be perfect, that will give us a foundation on which further things can be built. If we don't get that, then I think geopolitics will change again, and it may well change in a more negative way. So there's a window of opportunity, and everybody in this room has some degree of agency, some degree of influence, and some degree of ability to speak to politicians in each of our own countries. And I would encourage everybody to make that case, that there's a window of opportunity here to find an agreement, not perfect agreement, but at least an agreement on which can be built. And as a result of that, I think we will have a slightly safer world than we would have done.
What's one thing that really needs to be in the Pandemic Accord Treaty, whatever we're calling it, in your opinion?
Out of one, I'll choose three. One is, this goes back to something I was also involved in when I was living in Vietnam, which was around the time, if you remember it, of H5N1 bird flu. When the case of a certain country was made, why should we share our viral sequences of this new potential flu pandemic when all you'll do is sell us back a vaccine we can't afford? And at the heart of it, we've never answered that question. And during COVID, whatever your perspectives of the access to vaccines through 21, 22 and into 23, nevertheless, we in the North gave more succor to that argument because there was an unequal distribution of vaccines particularly during 2021. So we have also, in a sense, reaped what we sowed many years ago. We have to address this question of equitable access. And I think the only route to doing that is to do things which we're involved in, the technology transfer, the shift of the centre of gravity, the building of capacity in places that it's previously not existed. Now, I'm not naive to think that capacity can probably be built in the next 5 years in 194 countries, but we can shift some of that centre of gravity. And with the mRNA hubs and the development of new innovations, which industry here is also leading in certain countries, I think we can do that. The Pandemic Accord is important because it will give a not legally binding, but give a sort of morally binding push to have that shared in the centre of gravity. And then, of course, there's a big argument about intellectual property, which is a very, very tough argument and goes indeed beyond the pharmaceutical industry. I think that is actually solvable with things that we have, including through the World Trade Organization negotiations at the moment. So I think it's about inequality, it's about the fact that differential of speed, but it's also about having the capacity in countries that previously had not had the capacity to produce things like vaccines that we need to do during the rest of this decade. I would also argue, and I'm not from industry, this is also in industry's interests. Because actually, if you look over the next 20 or 30 years, which is where industry looks, where is the major growth markets for your industry over the next 30 years? It's in countries like Vietnam, it's in countries like South Africa, in Nigeria, in Mexico, in Argentina, and therefore pushing your own industrial bases away from the north, which is likely to stay fairly static in terms of economic opportunities, to areas of growth, I think would be, but I'm not a commercial or industrial person, so take that with a pinch of salt.
My last question to you is going back to sort of the core of your role as chief scientist. Science has come under immense pressure since the pandemic and during the pandemic, with many people sort of having a deep distrust of scientists and the institutions they represent, including the WHO, and including, many pharmaceutical companies. I haven't seen that many effective ways to tackle it that actually cuts through and gets that message across. I'm wondering how big a threat you think this is, and are there actual solutions that might work?
So it has been a huge threat, and there'll be many others as well as myself in the room over the last 3 years who've had things happen to us which are just, you have to say, I mean, living through it, just been unacceptable. Death threats, your house under 24-hour surveillance, alarm bells in your house that will, with the police guaranteed, armed police, this is in the UK when I was there, would be at the house within 90 seconds. Those are not normal times to be living through. Mm-hmm. But on this, I'm sorry to say it, but you have to be if you're a scientist, I'm a little bit more optimistic than sometimes the press says. If you'd said to me 3 years ago that approximately 7 to 7.5 billion people around the world would turn up at a football stadium, a supermarket, a pharmacy, get injected by somebody and their children and their grandparents that they've never met before to receive a vaccine that had never actually been tested or tried before COVID, and that they would turn up again and again and again to have that with booster doses, I'd have bitten your arm off. I think there is more trust in the endeavour than perhaps the social media and, yes, loud voices from the anti-vaccine movement, and I think this is perhaps different in North America than it is here in Europe. But I'm a little bit more positive that actually the broad scientific endeavour is more trusted than perhaps it was pre-COVID. And I'm not naive and I'm not complacent about that. But you also got to ask why that's true. And if you look across Europe pre-pandemic and you ask in Europe who has trust in institutions, whichever of your institutions you may talk about, from public health institutions to universities to academic institutions and indeed to large tracts of industry, the trust levels are higher than they are in some parts, for instance, of the United States. That is something you should never take for granted. You must work on continuously, and you could lose in an instant. But trust is at the heart of every public health. And if our politicians, and there are politicians around the world who will systematically undermine institutions, that's a very, very dangerous way forward, whether it's the judiciary, whether it's the public health authorities, whether it's the universities, the police. These key institutions are actually what hold the fabric of society together. And I would counsel all politicians to not undermine systematically those key institutions. Politicians will come and go, but those institutions will be there for decades, if not centuries. And if we undermine those key institutions of society, then the whole trust in the concept of society is lost.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, and thank you so much for making the trip from Geneva. We don't normally do claps, but we're going to clap.